Imagine contracting a singer for the most important night of your life, your engagement party. Imagine the flowers, the champagne, the guest list, everything perfectly arranged. And then imagine the moment the lights hit the stage, and you realize the woman standing there, the woman about to sing, is the one person you never stopped loving, the one you let go, the one who disappeared without a word, and who, you're about to discover, took something with her that was always yours. This is the story of Magnolia Hayes and Kai-Tae Choi, and the night that broke everything open. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe, leave a comment, and let's begin. The flight from Atlanta to Seoul was 11 hours and 40 minutes long. Magnolia Hayes had counted every single one of them. It was not her first time making that trip. 5 years ago, she had made it in the opposite direction, Seoul to Atlanta, in the middle of a January that felt like the coldest of her life, sitting in a window seat with a blanket pulled to her chin and her hands folded over a secret that was just barely beginning to show. She had told herself she was leaving because it was right, because it was necessary, because some doors, once closed, need to stay that way. She had almost believed it. Now it was late spring. The year was 2024. Magnolia was 32 years old, and she was going back. Not for him. She had made that very clear, to herself, mostly, because there was no one else to tell. She was going because the contract was good, because the fee would cover 3 months of rent, Benjamin's preschool tuition, and the recording session she'd been postponing for almost a year. Because her manager had called it a career reset opportunity, and because Magnolia was tired, deeply tired, of waiting for a break that never quite arrived on its own. Her voice was still there. That much she knew. It had survived everything else. The heartbreak, the pregnancy, the years of small gigs and half-empty rooms, and the particular loneliness of raising a child while also trying to be an artist. Her voice had not abandoned her, even when everything else had. So she was going to Seoul to use it. That was all. The booking had come through a corporate events agency, private engagement party for a high-profile client, intimate crowd, premium fee, round-trip business class, hotel accommodation for 2 nights. Magnolia had negotiated a 3rd night to allow for travel with her son. The agency had agreed without pushing back, which told her the client had money to spend and didn't feel like being difficult about it. She hadn't asked for the client's name. The agency hadn't offered it. That detail, small and unremarkable at the time, would cost her everything. Benjamin was 4 years old and extraordinarily unimpressed by airplane food. He sat beside her for most of the flight, his small feet not quite reaching the floor, systematically dismantling a packet of crackers and asking her, with the patience of someone who already knew the answer would be yes, whether he could watch another cartoon. Magnolia said yes every time. She was not above bribery on an international flight. He had her mouth, her laugh. The particular way he tilted his head when he was thinking about something, but his eyes, dark, quiet, watchful, were not hers. She had learned to look at those eyes without flinching. She had learned a lot of things. They arrived in Seoul on a Wednesday morning. The hotel was in Gangnam, clean and cool and smelling faintly of eucalyptus, and Benjamin immediately declared the bathtub to be the best thing he had ever seen in his life. Magnolia let him have his moment. She unpacked her performance dress, midnight blue, long, fitted at the waist, the fabric catching light the way still water does when something moves underneath it, and hung it on the back of the bathroom door where the steam from Benjamin's bath would release the travel creases. She had chosen that color without thinking about it too hard, or so she'd told herself. The event was scheduled for Friday evening. She had 2 days to rest, rehearse with the venue's audio team, and convince herself that Seoul was just a city, that she had been in other cities, that geography had no memory. She almost made it to Friday without feeling anything. The venue was on the 47th floor of a building in Uido, with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the Han River into something cinematic. Magnolia arrived 2 hours early, as she always did. and spent the first 40 minutes in the empty room with the sound engineer, adjusting levels, marking her position on the stage, confirming the set list. The stage was small, a raised platform no bigger than a living room rug, positioned at the far end of the room. 50 chairs arranged in soft arcs around low tables, white peonies everywhere, champagne already chilling. The kind of event that had been planned by someone with both money and taste, and possibly a great deal of ambition about what the photographs would look like afterward. Magnolia did not know who had planned it. She changed in a side room off the kitchen, zipped herself into the blue dress, checked her earrings, and stood in front of a narrow mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm that she looked like herself. Not the version of herself that had been ground down by years of struggle. The other one, the one who still believed that walking into a room should mean something. She looked like that version. She stepped out. Guests began arriving around 7. She could hear them through the curtain she stood behind, the low murmur of Korean conversation, the delicate percussion of glasses being lifted and set down, the particular kind of laughter that happens between people who are comfortable with wealth and each other. She was not nervous. She had performed in rooms like this before. At 7:45, someone on the other side of the curtain tapped a glass 3 times. The room quieted. An MC, smooth voice, practiced timing, said something in Korean that made the crowd respond warmly, and then switched to English to welcome international guests. Magnolia caught the phrase, engagement celebration, and the names of the couple, though she missed the first name before the surname Choi. She had already straightened her shoulders and was preparing to move when the full name landed in her ears, said again by the MC, clearly, with a raise in his voice for ceremony. Ki-tae Choi. She stopped. For a second. Just one. She stopped breathing. Her hand found the edge of the curtain and held it, not to push through, but to hold herself upright. The room on the other side of the fabric continued its applause, warm and oblivious, and somewhere in it was the man she had not seen in 5 years, 3 months and 11 days. Not that she had been counting, not that the number had ever meant anything. She let go of the curtain. She was a professional. She had built herself back up from nothing, piece by piece, in rooms where no one knew her name. She had delivered Benjamin alone at 3 a.m. in a hospital in Atlanta, with only a night nurse for company, and she had not fallen apart. She was not going to fall apart now. The MC introduced her. The curtain opened. The lights found her. She walked to the microphone, and she looked at the room. And Ki-tae Choi looked back at her. He was seated in the front row, as she might have expected, because he was the event. He sat very still in the way that people sit when their body has registered something their mind has not yet processed. A kind of suspended animation, every muscle holding. The woman beside him, elegant in ivory, was already smiling at the stage. Ki-tae was not smiling. His eyes were exactly as she remembered them. Dark and very still, and currently full of something that was not quite shock, but was its nearest neighbor. Magnolia held the microphone. 1 second passed. Then she began to sing. She had chosen the set list 2 weeks ago, in her apartment in Atlanta, without any knowledge of who she was choosing it for. But music has a way of knowing what the mind refuses to acknowledge, and every song she had picked, without consciously understanding why, was the kind that only makes sense when you are standing in front of someone you never stopped loving and singing directly to them with no protection and nothing left to lose. She sang to him, not to the room, not to the occasion. She sang to Ki-tae Choi, and every person in that room felt it, and not one of them understood exactly why the air had changed, only that it had, and that whatever was happening on that stage was not a performance in the way performances usually are. It was something older. It was confession without words. It was 5 years of silence finally given a voice. Ki-tae did not look away. Across the table, Yerin Kwan sat with a champagne glass at her lips and watched her plan begin to deviate from its intended trajectory. She had arranged this deliberately. She had found Magnolia Hayes 6 weeks ago, a name buried in Kitay's past that he never mentioned, never explained, but which appeared in enough old photographs and deleted social media posts to tell a story to anyone willing to look. She had recognized immediately what Magnolia must have been to him. And she had recognized, with the particular clarity of a woman who had watched her fiancé be present in every room except the ones that mattered, that the ghost of Magnolia Hayes was part of why Kitay had never fully arrived in their relationship. She had thought, bring the ghost into the room. Let Kitay see her, worn down by years, diminished, a reminder of what he had wisely left behind. Let the contrast do the work. Let him look at a struggling singer, and then look at Yerin Kwan, and finally choose. What she had not accounted for was the blue dress. What she had not accounted for was the way Magnolia Hayes, not diminished at all, walked to that microphone like the room had been waiting for her specifically. What she had not accounted for was that Kitay would look at Magnolia the way a man looks at the one thing he gave up, that he has never stopped grieving. Yerin set her champagne glass down very carefully. The plan had not gone the way she intended, but the night was not over. Magnolia finished the set with the kind of stillness that follows something true. The room applauded, genuinely, warmly, the kind of applause that means people are moved and aren't entirely sure why. She thanked them, briefly, professionally, and walked off the stage. She did not look at him again. She changed quickly in the side room, packed her performance bag, and was already moving toward the service exit before the next round of toasts had begun. The hotel was 20 minutes away by car. Benjamin would be asleep by now, the babysitter reading quietly in the armchair by the window. Magnolia needed to be back in that room. She needed to close the door and sit on the floor and press her back against the bed and breathe until the feeling in her chest, the one that was equal parts grief and something she refused to name, settled into something manageable. She had almost reached the elevator when she heard her name. She kept walking. A hand, not grabbing, just present, touched her arm. She stopped, not because she had to, because stopping was the honest thing, and she had spent 5 years doing the dishonest thing, the safe thing, the necessary thing, and tonight she was tired in a way that went all the way down. She turned around. Kitay stood in the corridor in his suit, looking the way people look when they have run from one room to another and arrived to find they don't know what they came to say. He was 33 years old, and he had gray at his temples that hadn't been there before. And there was something in his expression that she recognized as the same thing she felt every time she looked at Benjamin's eyes in a certain light. Behind him, at the far end of the corridor, Yerin had appeared. She stood very still, watching. Magnolia looked at Kitay. He opened his mouth. She shook her head, just once, not unkindly, but firmly, the way you close a door that you know you cannot afford to leave open. Then she stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Kitay stood in the corridor and did not move for a long time. Yerin walked to him, took his arm, and guided him back toward the party with the smooth efficiency of someone who has practiced managing difficult situations. He let himself be guided. His body was still there, performing the necessary functions of a man at his own engagement party, but the part of him that made choices, the part that had been dormant for 5 years, had just been jolted back to life by a blue dress and a voice that sang every word directly at him. He smiled for photographs. He raised his glass. He answered questions about wedding dates and honeymoon destinations. At midnight, lying in the dark in the apartment he shared with no one, he and Yerin had maintained separate residences, a detail both of them had quietly agreed was reasonable without examining why. He opened his phone. He stared at the ceiling. He put the phone down. He picked it up again. He typed her name into a search engine. It took him 40 minutes to find it. He was not looking for it. He had been looking for her, for evidence of her life, for the shape of the years he hadn't been part of, for confirmation that she was fine, that she had built something good. that the guilt he carried like a stone in his chest had been, if not earned, at least proportionate to the damage. He found old performance clips, a sparse website, a social media profile, infrequently updated, mostly photographs from small venues, and one recurring image that appeared across several posts: a child, a small boy with a wide, uncomplicated smile. Kite almost scrolled past it. He didn't. He clicked. He enlarged. He sat with the photograph on his screen for a very long time, in the specific silence of a man whose mind is doing mathematics it did not expect to be doing at 1 a.m. He looked at the date on the post. August 2020, a birthday, a small child turning 1, a caption that said nothing except a single heart. He counted backward. He counted again. His hands were very still. August 2020, 1-year-old, born August 2019. Conceived. His mind did the calculation with a terrible, precise clarity. In the winter of 2018, November, December. The last months they had been together. He put the phone face down on the mattress. He stared at the ceiling. He thought about Magnolia in January 2019, boarding a plane without a word of explanation, not answering his calls, not responding to his messages, disappearing so completely that he had eventually, after months, after a year, after telling himself the story enough times that it started to feel true, convinced himself she had simply decided to leave, that she had stopped wanting the life they were building, that her departure was a choice about him, not about anything else. He thought about a child with dark, watchful eyes. He picked the phone back up. He looked at the photograph again. He knew those eyes. He had seen them in mirrors his entire life. He was on his feet before he had made a conscious decision to stand up. It was 2:15 in the morning when he knocked. He had her hotel information because the events agency had CC'd all correspondence to his assistant, who had forwarded everything to a shared folder, and Kite had spent 20 minutes finding the right email. He was aware, distantly, that showing up at a woman's hotel room at 2 a.m. was not a reasonable thing to do. He was also aware that he had crossed some threshold in the last hour beyond which reasonableness had ceased to be the governing principle. He knocked. A long pause. Then the door opened, still chained, a narrow strip of light and Magnolia's face. She looked at him. She didn't look surprised. She looked instead like someone who had been expecting this and had spent the last 2 hours deciding what to do when it arrived. She closed the door. He heard the chain release. The door opened. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that means a child is sleeping nearby. A door to the adjoining room stood slightly ajar. Magnolia stepped into the main room and pulled it almost closed behind her, leaving just enough gap that she could hear if he woke. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not invite Kite to sit. He stood in the middle of the room, still in his suit from the party. He looked like a man who had driven across a city in the middle of the night, without once looking at himself in a mirror, which was exactly what he was. The question came out of him quietly, not as an accusation, but as something he was barely holding together. How old is he? It wasn't a question. Not quite. It was the shape of a question wrapped around something that already knew its answer. Magnolia looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at him. 4. He turned 4 in August. The room held that number for a long moment. Kite sat down. Not in a chair. There was no chair close enough. He sat on the floor. Just sat down on the floor of a hotel room at 2 a.m, because his legs had decided that standing was no longer something they were willing to do. Magnolia watched him. She did not reach for him. She did not soften. His voice, when it came, was very quiet. Not angry. Not yet. Just hollowed out, stripped of everything except the weight of what he needed to understand. Why didn't you tell me? She let the silence sit for a moment before she answered, because the answer was not a simple one, and she had rehearsed too many versions of it over too many years to produce it quickly. She had found out 2 weeks before she left. She had not left because of it. She had left because of what his mother had said to her the week before, in a restaurant in Gangnam. With the particular precision of a woman who has decided a conversation needs to happen, and intends to finish it efficiently. His mother had made it clear. Magnolia was a charming distraction. The Choi family had obligations that required a specific kind of partner, and she hoped Magnolia understood. Magnolia had waited a week for Ki-tae to say something, anything, and he hadn't. His silence had been its own answer. She had made the decision alone, the way she had made every decision since. Alone, without asking for help, without waiting for someone to choose her. Ki-tae listened to all of this without moving. When she finished, he looked up from the floor. His voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of a man trying not to break something that was already cracked. "I didn't know what she said to you." Magnolia held his gaze. "Maybe not, but you knew something was wrong, and you said nothing." He had no answer for that, because it was true. He had known something was shifting, and he had told himself it would resolve. That Magnolia would tell him what was bothering her, that it was not his place to pry. He had told himself those things because they were easier than confronting his mother, easier than choosing loudly and publicly in a way that his family would not forgive. He had waited, and she had left, and he had spent 5 years constructing a narrative in which her departure was the action, and his passivity was merely the context. He went back to looking at the floor. Then, from behind the slightly open door, a small sound. Feet on the floor. A child's sleepy shuffle. The door pushed open a little more, and Benjamin stood in the gap, 4 years old and disoriented by the dark and the unfamiliar room, his hair flattened on one side from sleeping. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at the man sitting on the floor. Ki-tae looked back at him. Benjamin, satisfied by some private assessment, walked to his mother and climbed into her lap without ceremony, tucked his head under her chin, and went back to sleep in the way that only small children can, completely, instantly, with total trust. Magnolia held him and did not look at Ki-tae. Ki-tae looked at both of them and did not speak for a long time. When he finally found his voice, it was different, quieter, cracked at the edges in a way she hadn't heard before. Just 2 words, barely above a whisper. His name. Benjamin. Ki-tae repeated it softly, as if he were learning a word in a new language. Then he stood up, slowly, and looked at her with something she could not entirely read. Grief, certainly, and underneath it something that had not yet decided what form to take. "I'm going to go." He paused at the door. "But I'm not done." She didn't answer. He left. Yerin Kwan sat in her apartment that same night and replayed the evening with the analytical discipline of someone who does not permit herself to be defeated without understanding exactly where the calculation failed. She had known about Magnolia. She had not known about the child. She was not, by nature, a cruel person. She was a strategic one, which is a different thing, though the line between them can blur under pressure. She had grown up in a family where position and alliance were the grammar of every relationship, and she had learned early that wanting something was not sufficient. You had to be the correct answer to someone's question. She had decided, 2 years ago, that she was the correct answer to Ki-tae's question. She had been patient. She had been present. She had built the architecture of their relationship with care. What she had not been able to build was the part that makes someone look at you the way Ki-tae had looked at Magnolia Hayes from the front row of his own engagement party. She sat with that recognition for a long time. It was not comfortable. It was, however, honest, and Yerin, whatever her faults, had always respected honesty when it was unavoidable. There was a child. The child was his. She was certain of it, in the same way she was certain of all things she had not been told, but had the intelligence to deduce. She picked up her phone. She thought about calling Ki-tae. She put the phone down. Some things, she thought, could not be managed. Some things simply had to be allowed to happen. She had set the stage thinking she knew what play was being performed. She had been wrong about the play. She sat very still in her apartment and let herself feel, for exactly as long as it took, the particular grief of a woman who had almost had something and understood, precisely and too late, why it had always been almost. Magnolia woke at 6 with Benjamin sitting on her chest announcing that he was hungry and that Seoul had a very tall sky. She made him toast from the hotel breakfast menu and sat by the window and watched him eat, and tried to organize the previous night into something she could carry without it breaking her. She failed, mostly. At 9, her phone rang. An unknown Korean number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Kitae's voice was different in the morning, less fractured, more deliberate, as if he had spent the night deciding what kind of man he intended to be. I need to see him. Not to claim anything, not to make demands. I just need... He stopped. He started again. I missed 4 years. I don't know how to say what that means. I just know I can't miss another day if there's a choice. Magnolia looked at Benjamin, who had discovered the television remote and was pressing every button with the focus of a researcher. Her voice was level, measured. The voice she used when she needed to say something true without letting it become a fight. You haven't chosen anything yet, Kitae. A late-night visit to a hotel room and a phone call is not a choice. Choices have weight. They cost something. Come back to me when you've paid something. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I ended it with Yerin this morning. Magnolia closed her eyes. That's not about me. Her voice was quiet but certain. That's about you finally being honest with yourself. Don't use that as currency with me. Another silence. Then, quietly, you're right. I know you're right. Don't come to the hotel. Her voice was steady. I need the day. He agreed, and she noticed, with the part of her that was still paying attention to such things, that he agreed without arguing, without negotiating, without the passive waiting that had defined him 5 years ago. Okay. I'll wait. Just 2 words. No negotiation. And something about the simplicity of it stayed with her long after she hung up. She spent the day with Benjamin. They walked along the Han River in the late spring warmth, and he pointed at everything with the democratic enthusiasm of a 4-year-old encountering the world at full volume. And she held his hand and tried to think clearly. She thought about what it would mean to let Kitae in, not into her heart. That door had never properly closed, and she was honest enough to admit it. Into their life. Into the daily, mundane, unglamorous reality of raising a child. The school runs and the fever nights and the arguments about vegetables and the moments. The small, private, perfect moments that she had accumulated alone for 4 years and that she had told herself were enough because they had to be. She thought about his mother. She thought about what it would mean to trust a man who had failed her once. Not out of malice, but out of something quieter and in some ways worse. Cowardice. The particular cowardice of a person who loves you, but not enough to fight for you in the rooms where fighting costs the most. She thought about Benjamin, who deserved to know his father if his father intended to be worth knowing. She thought about herself, not the version that had survived, but the version that had always wanted more than survival. That evening, she booked her return flight. Sunday morning, Atlanta. She and Benjamin would go home. Kitae did not call again that day. He had said he would wait, and he waited. He spent the day doing the things that needed to be done. He called his mother, a conversation that lasted 47 minutes and covered territory that had needed covering for years. His mother was not without intelligence, and she understood, by the end of it, that she had made a calculation in a Gangnam restaurant 6 years ago that had cost her son something he had not yet finished paying for. She did not apologize, exactly, but she listened, and at the end she said his name in the particular way she had when he was a child, and she was asking him to be careful. And he understood it as the closest she knew how to get. He called his lawyer. Not about custody. Not yet. Not without Magnolia's knowledge and consent. Just to understand what the landscape looked like. To be the kind of man who prepares rather than reacts. He sat in his apartment and thought about 5 years. He thought about the night he had found out she'd left. Not a note, not a message. Just her phone disconnected and her things gone in a silence that he had initially filled with explanations before the explanations ran out, and only the silence remained. He had been 28 years old. He had told himself that she had made her choice. He had told himself that her leaving said something about her feelings that he needed to accept. He had spent 5 years believing a story that was much simpler and much more self-serving than the truth. The truth was that he had known something was wrong. The truth was that his mother had said something. He hadn't known what. Not the specifics, but he had known the meeting happened. His mother had told him, casually, that she'd had coffee with Magnolia, that they'd had a lovely chat. He had not asked what the chat was about. He had not asked because he had not wanted to know. And he had not wanted to know because knowing would have required him to choose, and choosing would have required a kind of courage he had not yet grown into. At 28, he had not been equal to the moment. The question was whether he was equal to it now. He sat with that question for a long time. He could not answer it from the inside. You could not prove courage by thinking about it. You could only prove it by what you did when it cost something. He thought about Benjamin's eyes, about the way the boy had looked at him from the doorway. Not with recognition, obviously, but with a child's uncomplicated assessment, the kind that sees exactly what is in front of it, and no more. He thought about the blue dress. He thought about a voice that had sung every unsaid thing directly at him, across a room full of witnesses. He thought, if she leaves again, at least this time it will not be because I said nothing. Sunday morning, 6:45, Incheon International Airport, departures level. Magnolia had checked in early. She preferred airports when they were quiet, before the crowds built to a pressure she could feel in her chest. Benjamin was in a rolling carry-on harness that he had insisted on because he had seen another child using one the day before, and had determined this to be the superior method of airport travel. She pulled him gently through the terminal, and he rolled along behind her, uncomplaining, eating a banana. She had not told Kaite her flight time. She had not told him she was leaving today. She had made a decision, sitting by the river the previous afternoon, that she was not going to make this easy or false. If he was serious, if this was the version of him that had finally grown into the moment, he would find out, the way serious people find out things when they need to know them. And if he didn't, she would go home and continue building the life she had been building, and it would be fine, because she had learned that fine was actually quite livable when you stopped waiting for it to be something else. She found their gate. She sat down. Benjamin abandoned the harness in favor of her lap and fell immediately back to sleep, because 4-year-olds have no relationship with airport anxiety. Magnolia rested her chin on the top of his head. She told herself she was fine. She was not fine. She was the particular kind of not fine that comes from wanting something badly and having made peace, very convincing, very practiced peace, with not having it, and then having it come close enough to touch and choosing, again, the practiced peace because it was the only version of safety she had ever been able to construct for herself. The gate area filled slowly, announcements in Korean, then English. Final boarding in 20 minutes. She did not look up when the gate door opened. She did not look up when the footsteps stopped. She looked up when he sat down in the empty seat next to her. Kitae was wearing jeans and a plain sweater, and he looked, for the first time in all the years she had known him, like a man who had not dressed for an occasion, but had simply put on what was at hand, and gotten into a car at whatever hour was required. There was something about that, the absence of performance, that undid her more than anything else could have. How? The word came out before she could stop it, meaning, how did you know? Your manager's assistant. His voice was even, unhurried, as if he had rehearsed the calm, I called the events agency at 5 this morning. I'm aware that's a lot. She almost smiled. Almost. He looked at Benjamin, asleep against her. I'm not here to give a speech. His voice dropped. Quieter now. Stripped of strategy. I have things to say, and I'll say all of them. Every time you want to hear them. For as long as it takes. But right now, I needed you to know that I'm here. That I showed up. That this is what choosing looks like when it actually costs something. Magnolia looked at him. It cost you a 5 a.m. phone call in a taxi. Kai-Tai. Her voice was careful. Not unkind, but not soft either. That's not... I ended the engagement. He didn't let the sentence trail. I had a conversation with my mother that I should have had 6 years ago. I'm not asking you to reward any of that. I'm asking you to let me prove that I'm capable of more than I was. Over time. On your terms. In whatever way makes sense for Benjamin first and us. If there's an us. Second. She was quiet. Benjamin shifted in her lap, sighed deeply, resettled. Kite looked at his son, and something in his face was so unguarded, so completely without armor, that Magnolia had to look away for a moment. I'm not saying yes. She looked back at him when she was ready. I know. Not to us. Not today. Maybe not for a long time. What happened can't be undone by an airport and good intentions. I know that too. But Benjamin deserves to know his father. Her voice didn't waver. If you're going to be that, if you're actually going to be that, consistently, without conditions, then we can figure out what that looks like. Kite nodded. I'm not easy, Kite. I wasn't 5 years ago, and I'm less easy now. I have a child and a career I'm rebuilding, and exactly zero interest in being anyone's consolation story. You were never a consolation. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Something older than that. You were always the real thing. I just wasn't brave enough to say so at the right time. Magnolia looked at him for a long time. Final boarding call for the Atlanta flight echoed through the gate. She stood, gathering Benjamin carefully, the boy redistributing his weight against her shoulder without waking. She picked up her bag. She looked at Kite, who was standing too, hands at his sides, waiting. She looked at Kite one last time. I'll text you when we land. It was not a declaration. It was not forgiveness or reconciliation or a happy ending with music. It was a door, opened a crack, not enough to walk through, but enough to let light in. Kite exhaled, just once, quietly. She walked to the gate. She didn't look back, but her hand, just before she turned the corner, gave one small wave. The recording studio in Atlanta smelled like coffee and old carpet, and the specific kind of possibility that only exists before a take. Magnolia stood behind the microphone with her headphones around her neck and her eyes closed, listening to the playback through the glass. The engineer said something she didn't catch. She nodded anyway. She was thinking about the bridge, whether the note on the second bar needed to be held a beat longer, whether the restraint was doing more work than the release. Her phone, face up on the console, showed a photo that had arrived that morning from a soul number, Benjamin Bawati, at a park she didn't recognize, sitting on the shoulders of a man who was looking up at him with the expression of someone who has been given something they know they do not deserve and intend to spend their life being worthy of. It was Kite's third visit to Atlanta. They had not made any declarations. They had not used any of the large words, love, future, us, out loud, to each other, in a way that required an answer. They had, instead, done smaller things. He had sat on her kitchen floor while she cooked and talked to her about his week. She had called him when Benjamin had a fever at 2 a.m, not because she needed help, but because she had wanted to tell someone who cared. He had sat at the back of a small venue in Midtown 2 weeks ago and listened to her perform, and afterward, He had not said that she was brilliant or beautiful, or that it was everything he remembered. He had said, quietly, that he had no idea what he'd been thinking, letting that go. She had said, I know. They were learning each other again. Not from the place they'd left off. That place no longer existed. From somewhere new. Somewhere that required them both to be different people than they'd been. It was slow. It was imperfect. There were conversations that left her exhausted, and evenings that ended with things unresolved, and mornings where she looked at her ceiling and asked herself whether she was being careful or just afraid. She was asking the question, though that was new. 5 years ago, she had stopped asking and simply left. She understood now that leaving had been the only tool she had at the time, the only form of self-protection she trusted. She understood also that she had more tools now. She had built them herself, slowly, in the years between, out of necessity, out of solitude, out of the particular education that comes from raising a child alone and discovering that you are, against all expectation, capable. She was capable. She had always been capable. She was just, finally, starting to believe it in the way that doesn't require external confirmation. The engineer's voice came through the glass. Ready when you are. Magnolia put her headphones on. She thought about a room full of white flowers in Seoul, about a man frozen in his front row seat, about a small boy who had looked at a stranger on a hotel room floor and gone back to sleep without fear. She thought about a door open just a crack. She thought, this is what the next chapter sounds like. She opened her mouth. She sang, if this story stayed with you, if you felt every moment of it, subscribe, share, and come back for the next one. Drop a comment. Whose side were you on at the airport? The next story's coming soon. Don't miss it.